We'll be posting them on YouTube and putting the links in the Slack channel, the resources Slack channel for folks to watch that can't join us during the day. If you want to engage with us on social media, always feel free to use the hashtag xAPI cohort, tag xAPI gnome, and let us know what you think and how you're using what you learned today. So today's agenda, we have Leanne G., the course development team lead from Torrance Learning. She's going to share a little bit about sending data from e-learning tools and some case examples of what that looks like. Then we'll jump into cohort business, and I'll show you a little bit of Slack information so you can learn to navigate Slack. We'll talk a little bit about GitHub and joining GitHub. And then we'll talk about what your team should have to be successful, including a team and project briefs. So that is our agenda for today. We are at 395 folks registered for cohort, which is awesome. I went to the Ann Arbor ATD professional development session yesterday, and one of the speakers talked about being a member of the second cohort, and there only being 30 people at that time. We're now in the 10th cohort, and our community is about 2,000 people total, but we ask folks to re-sign up every semester. We don't just roll over their membership, so having 400 people on this, almost 400 people, is pretty impressive and amazing. So welcome to the community for our first timers, and welcome back for everybody who's been here. Behind the mics today on cohort, you have me, Jessica Jackson, and Leanne G is our guest presenter. We're all part of the Torrance Learning team, and then we have our production team who helps us run smoothly, Aaron and Jamie. So thanks everyone who's helping us keep things running smoothly. Yes, J-Rock, xAPI cohort 10. Today, we're going to talk about project briefs and team tips for team traction. And then we're going to have the presentation around sending data from e-learning tools. Next week, what you can look forward to is learning about sending data from something that's not e-learning, and that's going to be presented by Matt Cleaver. So really excited about all of the good learning that'll be happening throughout cohort. I do want to call your attention to the xAPI Party and the Download, which is another conference in May here in Chelsea. So you can save the date. Oh no, maybe Jordan, your audio is muted. All right, with that, I'm gonna transition over to Leanne G., who again is the course development team lead from Torrance Learning, and she's gonna share all about sending data from e-learning tools.
All right. Hi, everybody. I am just going to get my screen set up here. I spend most of my time on the other end producing for these things, so it's funny how things change a little bit when you are on the other side. Can everyone confirm for me really quick in the chat that they can both hear me and see a title slide? Awesome. All right. So as Jeff mentioned, today I'm going to talk a little bit about sending data from e-learning tools. So much of what you'll hear talked about over the course of this cohort is going to be around how xAPI makes it possible to track learning, specifically that happens outside of the LMS, and it does, and it's awesome. But for those of you who may just be getting started with xAPI, or whose bread and butter is learning that happens within an LMS, there's still a lot that xAPI can do for you. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my team's experience in that space today. And I'm actually going to focus specifically on a certain project for most of today's session. It's one that we call Waterproof. as a code name here at Torrance Learning, and it's something that several of us worked on. And what you can't see is that I also have my colleague Linda here with me. She was an integral part of the project team, and so she'll be helping me answer questions that you may have as we go. So feel free to throw them in the chat as you have them, and we'll be able to either catch them as we're going along, or we can certainly circle back to them as we wrap up. So I'll start by sharing more about the project itself before moving into how we determined what to track and how we made that happen. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk today about a project called Waterproof. Waterproof was a project that we did for a global science materials company. We worked directly with one of their content partners and created several different deliverables to meet their needs. Our client's goal was to increase the productivity and performance of sales teams, and they were doing this by defining a new sales coaching culture. So since our client is a global company, a large part of this effort revolved around ensuring that the entire enterprise ended up using the same terminology and the same tools, and that ultimately sales leaders had the support that they needed so that they could, in turn, support their teams. So I'm sure that it will not come as a surprise to anybody here in the cohort today, but no project is without its challenges. So in order for us to do this right, there were a number of things that we needed to address. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, our client had multiple divisions in a number of different locations, each of which you could probably guess were operating in different ways. There had also been previous training initiatives that had been rolled out, but they hadn't been rolled out consistently or across all of the groups. So that resulted in different skills gaps, different ways of measuring data and different needs. As far as the data was concerned, there were some divisions that were measuring level 1 feedback, others that were tracking their typical SCORM data, so things like completion status, time spent, score, and regardless of how the groups were measuring data, what they were getting back was limited and varied. There are also, each of the locations were also using different systems. So some locations were using Salesforce, others were using something called Cognos, and the original plan that our client had been to shift everybody to Salesforce, but that initiative and rollout hadn't gone as well as they had hoped. So then another challenge was that there was already resistance to another rollout. And then there was just the fact that our client wanted learners to have a richer learner experience. So in this case, that meant personalization, the ability to engage in some type of learning on a quarterly basis, and a focus on relevant content and practical application. So ultimately, this led to the ideation and creation of several deliverables. And I'm going to try and cover them relatively quickly so that we do have more time to discuss the e-learning component and the data that we got out of that. But I think one of the key benefits to xAPI is the interoperability. And this project is definitely one where we were able to use xAPI to gather richer data than we otherwise would have been able to with a spec like SCORM. So there was a self-assessment piece, which was a diagnostic tool that was used at the beginning and the end of the learner's training journey, and that allowed them to focus on and track areas of growth. Now for this one, we only tracked completion status because we wanted learners to be as honest as possible with their answers. We also had an e-learning course which covered the benefits of coaching and why it mattered. We designed it so that learners could go through it at their own pace and revisit content based on their own needs. It also included resources and tools that learners could download. There was an ILT and VILT component, so that's instructor-led training and virtual instructor-led training, and these provided opportunities to disperse best practices and a toolkit, which I will get into in a moment. The format allowed associates to have conversations in a safe space, provided opportunities to reflect on individual work and issues, and really allowed people to get on the same page, which, as I talked earlier about the challenges and kind of needs for this particular client, was super important to the success of this particular initiative. There was also a toolkit which provided ongoing support for associates. So there was a results tool which was for use during coaching conversations and provided a way to capture topics that were discussed, objectives for the next coaching conversation, any relevant notes. We also had a prioritization checklist which was used by team leads and served as a way to assess each associate's skills and knowledge and their coachability based on a high, medium, and low ranking. We had a planning tool which helped leaders outline what they wanted to cover during a coaching conversation, and an app-based flashcard deck that we created through an app called Flip, which provided performance support so associates could review terms, review the different types of coaching, and things like that. The last piece that we created was curriculum for cohort groups. So those were small groups intended to create space for deeper discussions and to help people internalize what they had learned in their everyday practice. Next slide is not switching. Here we go. So once we had a good handle on the challenges and ideas for how we could address them, we needed to figure out what we were going to track. So we brainstormed with our client around two major questions. The first was, what data is important and useful to our client? And the second was, what data will help learners do their job? And when we asked those questions, some of the answers came out naturally just in discussions with our subject matter experts, and some of them weren't necessarily novel. So for example, since the meat of the self-assessment data was only shared with learners, we only tracked the number of assessments completed and kind of compared the data before and after. And with the e-learning, we still felt like things like completions, time revisited, access to the downloads were helpful. In addition to the two questions around data, we also thought through the traditional levels of evaluation and asked ourselves and our client how we could measure each of them. So for level 1, we had a survey that learners completed after every in-person session. For level 2, we had a post-test or a final certification, which was something that learners completed after they had finished their learning journey in its entirety, so after they had gotten through each of the deliverables that I mentioned a few minutes ago. For level 3, we had learners use their before and after self-assessment results and connect them to a larger professional development plan that they were doing already within their company. And then level 4, unsurprisingly, that one, the business impact is a little bit harder to measure because we didn't have a lot of opportunity to gain as much insight into the kind of the follow-up. So, I think as trainers and people that create these deliverables, we always want to think that the work that we're doing is having a huge impact on changes that are happening at the company, but it's not always easy to identify if specific outcomes are truly a result of the training after it's delivered. You know, there can be other factors or variables that impact the success or failure of an initiative, and as a vendor, you know, sometimes we finish something and we kind of, I don't want to say like we tossed over the fence, but there's a little bit of a kind of a blind spot there. So, like I said, level 4 was a little bit harder for us to have as much insight into. But after we took a deeper dive into insights around the learners and the program components and how to measure the success of those components, you know, we got to a point where we really started seeing the value of xAPI and the depth of the data that we could capture. So there were a number of tools that we used to capture data for this project. We used the Watershed LRS. We are fortunate enough to have people on our team that can do custom software development. So a lot of the tools that I mentioned in the toolkit were custom there. We used an app called Flip, which is a flashcard app, and we use that for the performance support piece, and that has xAPI integrated into it. We also used Survey Gizmo, which has an xAPI integration as well. And for the e-learning piece, we used Articulate Storyline and xAPI. For those of you who may not be familiar with xAPI, it's an xAPI statement builder that helps create the JavaScript triggers to send xAPI statements to the LRS of your choice. So for people like me who don't necessarily have that programming knowledge, it's a really easy way to get that JavaScript created. And it looks like per Jess's agenda that she shared at the beginning, that we're going to be talking about free tools next week. And Jess can keep me honest, but I believe cohort participants will be able to try out xAPI for themselves during the duration of the cohort. And yes. I also don't have eyes on the chat right now, so Jess could be could be telling me no, but I think that's what we've offered in the past.
You're yes, yes.
Oops, yeah, okay, perfect. So while we used Storyline and xAPI for this project, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there are several other authoring tools that support xAPI as well. And I think especially it's important to mention, if you were hoping that we'd do a deep dive today of specific tools and xAPI offerings, I actually want to say that a past group from Cohort wrote a really great article for Learning Solutions magazine, I think in 2018, and then updated it in the spring of last year. And that was all on xAPI out of the box, which goes into detail about what each of the tools that I have listed on screen provide in terms of xAPI. So I've included a link to the spring 2019 version on screen if you want to check that out. And then also one of the tools that we've used pretty extensively at Torrance Learning that has robust xAPI capabilities is Domino One. And I haven't highlighted it before this point, given that it wasn't something that we had used for this particular case study, but it offers a lot both out of the box and based on what you can do with some of the customization. And I think one of the really awesome things about xAPI Cohort, just while I'm on a roll here, is that there are a ton of people in here who have really deep tools knowledge. And so if you're looking for more information about xAPI and a specific tool, or you're one of the people that can offer more knowledge about xAPI and a specific tool, I would encourage everybody to connect up in the chat. Or as Jeff mentioned at the beginning, we have a really robust and active Slack community. So that would be a really great opportunity to connect about tools and the specificities around them as well. So returning back to the waterproof and kind of our case study, there's a lot that our client has been able to question or learn from the data captured from the e-learning course. And I think what's important to point out kind of going into this is that we get a lot of data from xAPI, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like as soon as we get the data that we end up being able to like immediately draw super clear conclusions. But what the data can do for us is help shape or inform a lot of meaningful conversations. So for example, with our question activity, multiple choice questions for waterproof were set up in a way that required learners to get their answer right the first time before, or not the first time, but get it right before they could move on. And so the data that we got from multiple choice questions seemed to point to an idea that learners were making decent efforts to get answers right the first time. So what actually became more interesting to us were what were the wrong answers that people were submitting. What were some of the concepts that learners maybe weren't connecting with. And similarly to multiple choice questions, select all that apply questions also needed to be answered correctly before learners could move on. So trends in that data seem to indicate that these were harder for the learners and that there were a high number of incorrect responses. So it was another place where we really became interested in looking at what were the wrong answers and kind of what are some of the questions that we can be asking ourselves about the why, and also what are some of the things that our client could be asking. None of the click to reveal interactions that we had prevented the learner from moving on, so they didn't have to click through everything before they could click next. We found that there was actually excellent engagement on these screens. We did start to see a bit of a drop-off on some of the last clicks. So, if there were 6 steps in an interaction, we'd probably see a bit of drop-off on steps 5 and 6. We also had these fact or myth flip cards early on in the course, so we were able to kind of extrapolate that learners were engaged. We saw the vast majority were clicking on every card, and in some cases, cards were being clicked on more than once. We also used xAPI to get information on how learners interacted with audio files. So we had a screen in the e-learning that learners could click on and they'd get an audio clip. And it was something that we ended up bringing back a couple screens later. And what we got from the xAPI data was that almost 1 in 3 learners opted to hear it again. On another screen, there was a hint button, and what the data showed us was that there was less engagement with that. So I think there was about 24, maybe 100 or 150 learners that were clicking on that. So I'll talk a little bit more to that screen when I show the example in a few minutes here. But again, it's kind of, okay, now that we have the data, what are the kind of questions that we can be asking around it, and how can we use that to kind of inform decisions moving forward. And then lastly, we also use xAPI to capture text responses. So unsurprisingly, there were some really great answers, and then there were also some answers that were just empty or throwaway responses. But I think even looking at that breakdown of kind of like which ones are great and which ones were less great provides some insight into overall engagement with the course content. So the next several slides that I'm going to run through provide a visual look at the data and the screens that we captured data from. This one in particular is one of our more recent looks at the data overall. And for this particular client, these spikes align with plans to roll out the initiative. So they had 3 different kind of divisions that they were rolling this out to. And so you can see that there was a big push at the beginning of the initiative, particularly of the self-assessment and e-learning components, since those are the pieces at the beginning of a learner's journey. And then there was another push towards the beginning of last year, and you'll notice as we get further out, the focus really shifts to the performance and toolkit pieces. So those are the purple bars on the chart there, which makes sense given where learners would be in their learning journey. So after having completed the self-assessment and the e-learning, they're then taking advantage of those pieces as they kind of move from the kind of like the classroom training to applying things on the job. So this is one of the specific screens from the e-learning that we chose to capture data from. Learners were asked to select why coaching seemed valuable to them at the beginning of the e-learning. And then what we actually did is we brought the same interaction back at the end of the e-learning, including the choices that they made, and they could reevaluate what they found valuable about coaching at the end. So the data that we got from this screen at the beginning, you can see the blue bars are the ones that they selected, and we actually also kept track of which ones they discarded. I think if we were to do the scanner in the future, we could probably just capture the selected values when the user leaves the slide. Capturing items that they discarded on this slide really, I think, only tells us that they were thinking about it and decided against it. But when we get to the data from the kind of the return of the interaction at the end, I think that's where what was discarded becomes a lot more interesting. You can see that there were a lot of discards in many cases. And again, I think we have to be honest that it's unclear in terms of does this mean that users discarded things that they chose originally, or that they selected new things and then decided against it. But on a couple of items, there are more discards than selections, which I think reflects that people discarded some selections from the original screen. And again, like at the very least, information gathered from this sort of data, I think can be a great talking point amongst leadership and learners, and again, it provides a way to show that learners were still engaged at the end of the e-learning course, because the interactions, again, they weren't gated, they didn't have to be completed. So learners at this point really could have just clicked next rather than actually taking time to think about the answers. This is another example where we used xAPI to track how learners were interacting with the screens. So there were only 2 responses, and the learner was given 1 chance to answer the question. And what we can see is that actually many of them got it wrong. And so again, I think this speaks to kind of like what are the questions that you can be asking? What are the things you can be learning from this? Is it a knowledge gap? Do we need to consider more support on this topic? Or is it more around how it's being taught? Do we need to reevaluate the activity? Do we need to reevaluate how the question is being phrased? So again, just some of the things that can inform some more meaningful conversation. This is an example of one of the click to reveal screens that I mentioned earlier. Again, I think the data just shows that there was high engagement, and as I mentioned, we do start to see some drop off as the learners move through the last click. We also had screens that offered a hint button, so learners could click it if they wanted more help. It didn't actually get many clicks. I think maybe an average of about 1 in 6 users. I think this is one of the places where, like, if reports could tell us who got each question right or wrong, or I mean, reports can tell us that, but if we were getting the reports that told us whether people were getting the questions right or wrong, you know, perhaps it would let us know if learners didn't need a hint or whether they didn't want to take the time to read it. You know, discussions with clients could be around, do we track more data about the hint button moving forward? You know, once we do, and we have, and we, you know, if we continue to have low engagement, what kind of action can we take? You know, do we start talking about whether we need the hint button to begin with? This is an example of one of the select all but apply questions. We can see from the data that this was another place where, that appeared to be difficult for some learners. There was a high number of incorrect responses, and it reflected that some users answered incorrectly on multiple occasions. And then this is an example of one of our free response questions. So we were able to capture the learner's answers using xAPI. So here we can see that learners were able to compare their responses to the right answer. And again, this is something that I think is helpful for leaders to see. You know, how are associates responding? You know, what's the language they're using? Is it on par with, you know, how the organization wants to see people coaching their teams? Even with throwaway answers, as I mentioned before, you know, what does this tell them about overall engagement? So that's basically what I have for you in terms of share out about Waterproof today. Certainly, we can take a few minutes here to do some follow-up questions, as I haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat myself. But I do have some information here on screen, so please feel free to reach out to Linda or myself. I also included some information for Torrance Learning if you haven't had the opportunity to connect with us through the cohort already. So thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit more about what we did. And I will take a look at some of the questions.
So there's a question on the prioritization tool completion. Can you go back to that screen?
Yeah.
And how it functioned?
I didn't actually show the prioritization tool.
Oh, maybe you spoke to it then.
Yeah, I mean, so as I'm talking to Linda, I don't have a screen that showed the prioritization tool because that was one of the things that that we did with custom development.
I just wanted to know how it functioned, and I'm not sure that we, without a visual, you can answer that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think without a visual, it's a little bit more difficult. But certainly, I mean, we can follow up afterwards if that, you know, if that question wants to be answered. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute so I can see the chat.
Next one might be a Matt question. It's been online. Matt's been answering questions too.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Oh, actually, you know, that'd be great because I didn't realize that Matt was in there. So, Matt, can you, you don't have to actually speak to it, but if you can maybe do a brief synopsis in the chat about the prioritization tool, that would be awesome because you were a person who made it.
And he's answered all the other questions.
Oh.
All right. Thank you, Leanne. I think that Matt has been actively answering all of the questions in the chat. So thank you so much, Matt.
Yes, thank you, Matt.
And thank you so much, Leanne, for sharing more about Watershed. I'm going to move into some cohort business to help folks navigate Slack, talk a little bit about GitHub, and just do some behind the scenes cohort business. So first, I'm going to show you really quickly some of our notation for within Slack. So we have a team workspace for xAPI cohort. You should have automatically been sent a link to join the Slack. If you have not been sent a link, feel free to email me and I will invite you. My email address is going to be on the last slide within this session. So you'll see that right on there. Within the xAPI cohort workspace in Slack, there are multiple channels. The channels that have team in front of them are teams that are working on projects. I'm going to, in a second, do a screen share to show you how to find Slack channels in case they aren't you aren't automatically added to them. In fact, for all the teams, discussions, meetup channels, you aren't automatically added to them. You will have to search for them. So I'll show you how to do that. So, for example, this is Team Internet of Things. It tells you information about it. If you click on channel details, it tells you the project brief. They were exploring what types of data can be transformed into xAPI statements from other sources. And you can skim all of the teams that are currently forming within cohort and see what interests you, lurk a little bit. And then if you don't see anything about what you want to work on, you can create your own team. So I've seen some new teams pop up even in the last week. For example, podcast. The main channel, the resources channel, the social channel, and the social media channel are all cohort-wide conversations. So that's everyone within cohort are automatically added to those channels. The other channels discuss, so the ones that have discuss in the front are conversations. They're not projects, but they're about topics and technologies. Conversations around geographic regions. So if there's a place like Michigan, we can have a Meetup Michigan where we talk about folks that are doing the work in Michigan and maybe they want to meet up. Their notation starts with meet up. And then cohort project teams, as I said, start with the notation team in front, and then a description of what their team is doing. So it can be a topical team, a technology team, a company team. I've seen a team for beginners. Yeah, no problem, Sam. So that's how things are notated. If you are starting a team, we do ask that you start your Slack channel with team in front, so that way folks know that that's a project they could be working on. Oh, okay. Oh, wait, what I'm going to transition into is showing you how to find teams on the Slack channel. So I'm sharing my screen to show the Slack channel. Can everyone see my Slack channel here? And when we're in the cohort workspace, you can see all of the channels that I'm a part of here. So we have beginners, discuss, meetups, all the teams. And if I'm looking for a channel that I'm not a part of, I would click on not this plus symbol, because that's going to create a channel. And I'm just looking for channels that already exist. So in order to browse all channels, I click on channels, and then I can search. And what I do is I don't even type anything to search, and I just scroll down to see, are there any new teams that have formed? Are there any new meetups that have formed? Are there any discussion channels that have formed? And that's how you find teams to look at and to join. So I know there has been a lot of question around how to find teams to join, and that's how you do that. If you need further support in finding teams, feel free to shout me out in Slack. I can help you. But I'm going to move in to talk about how to join GitHub pages. Yes, Michael, you can sort by the date they were created as well. So GitHub is really easy thanks to Matt Cleaver. Thank you, Matt. He created a GitHub Team Bot. So what you do for a Team Bot is when you're in Slack, if you hover over a discussion, so I'm going to show you that in just a second. If you hover over a discussion, you'll see 3 little dots, and you click on that, and that is the More Actions menu. When you click More Actions, there's actually a Team Bot to join a cohort GitHub. And when you click Join Cohort GitHub, there's a form that's populated. You can find your team in GitHub if your team already has a GitHub, and you could put your email or your existing GitHub user if you have one. So I'll show you really quickly how to do that by sharing my screen. So I'm here in my xAPI cohort. I'm looking at the post that Matt made in the main channel, which describes how to do this. Go over to More Actions, click Join Cohort GitHub, and then there's a form here. Currently, there is if you do not have a team that has been created for Spring 2020, you would click this Parent Team Spring 2020, and then you can join the Spring 2020 and we can create your team. But there's one team that already exists. I can join by putting my email, or I already have a GitHub address, which is xAPI Jess, and I would put my username there and then request to join. If you have questions about joining GitHub, as always, feel free to ask them in Slack, and we will help you join a team or create a team. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about writing a project brief and tips for getting team traction during cohort. So, yay, we already have teams forming this spring. We have some that have remained from last cohort, like Team Alexa, Team Pebble, Team Storyline. But we also have some new teams that have started. So Team Audio Video, Team Podcast. So they're starting to team mapping data. Those are already starting to form, which is great and exciting. But that if you're not sure what you want to be exploring with xAPI this cohort, and you still aren't sure about a team, that's perfectly okay. And you can take your time and continue to explore and lurk and look at different teams. If you have an idea for a project and you're ready to start that team channel right now, here's some tips on what successful cohort teams have usually had. So they have a team name, and the team name is descriptive of what they're looking at. They have a Slack channel. We have the optional feature of a GitHub repository, but every team will have a GitHub team page because that's where your weekly updates will be submitted. You should have a project brief that includes the question or area you want to explore, and the use case to provide context on what you're exploring, a time and means of meeting. So I've seen Team Pebble has already started scheduling their meetings, and they use Doodle to start to see where people can meet. I've seen Team Dragonstats using Zoom for their meetings, and they record them and then they share them. So you should all have those type of resources so that everyone can join and participate in your meetings. And then you will also want a statement sender and LRS, and we'll be talking about the free tools that cohort members get access to on our next web session. So stay tuned to next week to see what free licenses you get for the duration of cohort. And yes, xAPI is one of them, as Leanne mentioned. So let's say you have an idea and you're ready to start your team right now. Set up the Slack channel and then post a description in main to invite people to join. If you have no idea, start checking the Slack team channels and see what looks good. You can join in, contribute ideas, attend meeting, do some work, and just joining the Slack channel does not commit you to anything. So you can be a part of every Slack channel and just observe. Next week, we're going to talk about the free stuff that you get. Yes, we're vendor neutral, but the participation of the vendor community makes getting in and experimenting with xAPI easier and inexpensive. So we'll be able to see some of those things. Yes, the free loot. I wanted to really quickly, because I had some questions, like I feel like I don't know where I am. I don't know how to join a team. I don't know what team I'm interested in. And that's perfectly fine. Within these first 3 weeks, you're still getting to know xAPI and each other and the cohort and learning processes and learning to use maybe different technologies. We're forming, right? We might have conflict or we might storm, but it's perfectly fine. We're only in week 2. This is a super flexible learning experience. It's made for people who have jobs outside of cohort, and we want you to be able to tap in and tap out whenever you feel the need to. Your project teams will start getting into the nitty-gritty and digging into details, but at around a month in. So that's when they're thinking about how we're going to scope out assignments. We're going to start practicing with xAPI. We might start breaking things. And then as we get towards the end of cohort, so this is a 3-month experience. As we get to that last month, you should have had some time to get your hands dirty, try things out, and now you're starting to think about next steps and demonstrating your learning. Last cohort, we had so many opportunities for our team to present out some teams to present out what they're learning. 1 at the xAPI party in May, 2 on the demo weeks in the xAPI web sessions. 3, I've seen teams on podcasts. I've seen teams sharing out on their own professional networks. So we really do want you to be sharing out what you're learning in cohort. And yes, it's totally okay to be a beginner. Thanks, David. So where is Cohort Magic happening? It happens here every week on Adobe Connect during our weekly web sessions. It happens in Slack. It's happening on GitHub, and then it's happening in our free resources in Tool. So as we wrap up this week's call, I just want to remind you of some good stuff to know. 1, cohort meetings are weekly at 2 o'clock Eastern Time on Adobe Connect. Next week, Matt Cleaver is going to be talking about sending data from non-e-learning sources. We do have our xAPI party on May 7th in Michigan and online. You can register now using the link on the screen. And then, of course, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me, Jessica Jackson, at jjackson@torrancelearning.com, especially if you're not in Slack yet. So thank you all for joining. We're going to let you get out there and make something a little early today. So have a great Thursday, and we'll see you here next week, or we'll chat with you here next week.